I had always believed our life was perfect. I was a mother and wife, balancing both roles with what felt like a steady hand. My husband and I had been together for over a decade, and though time had worn the edges of our passion, we managed to navigate the everyday challenges. Our child, our son, was everything we had hoped for, a bright, curious boy full of energy. The house felt warm and full of life, even on days when it seemed like the routines were repetitive. Every night we'd fall asleep, exhausted but content, knowing tomorrow would be another day of the same. I never saw the cracks in the foundation, or maybe I simply chose not to. On the surface, there were no obvious signs that anything was amiss. We had our moments of closeness, of shared laughter, but there was an underlying current of distance that had started to creep into my marriage. It wasn't anything that could be pinpointed, just a feeling, a subtle shift. My husband and I had grown distant, and I didn't know how to address it. I couldn't tell if it was just the pressures of life or something deeper. Still, I told myself that things were fine. We were still together. We still had our family. We were still functioning as we always had. But deep inside, something inside me began to feel unsettled. I began to notice things, small details that nagged at me. The late nights, the lingering looks on my husband's face when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he would sometimes flinch when I reached for him. It wasn't overt, but it was there. I brushed it off. Maybe he was stressed with work. Maybe it was just the routine of life taking its toll. People didn't fall out of love overnight. I never questioned his loyalty, though. He was my partner, the father of our child. But in the quiet corners of my mind, there was a seed of doubt, one I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. I'd ask myself, was I enough? Had I become so consumed by the responsibilities of motherhood that I'd let something slip by unnoticed? Was he still in this with me, or was he beginning to pull away? Our son, in all his innocence, was the only constant source of joy and stability in the house. He was young, and his love for both of us was untainted by the complications of adult emotions. He filled the gaps that my husband and I seemed to have left for each other. His laughter echoed through the house, reminding me of the happiness we once had. Every day felt like we were on the brink of something wonderful, something we had always envisioned. But there was a growing tension within me, an unease that I couldn't explain. My husband's behavior seemed different, almost as though he was hiding something, though I couldn't put my finger on what. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe this was what married life became after years of raising a child and navigating careers. I never shared these thoughts with anyone. It felt wrong, even admitting them to myself. It wasn't the kind of thing you could easily talk about without sounding paranoid. And I didn't want to be the wife who questioned her husband's loyalty without reason. But as the days passed, that feeling grew stronger, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind telling me that things weren't quite right. Despite everything, I convinced myself it was just a phase. I tried to be a good wife, a good mother. I would keep everything together. We'd get through whatever was happening between my husband and me, because that's what couples do. They work through their problems, no matter how big or small. But I knew, deep down, that the seed of doubt had already been planted. And it was only a matter of time before something would come to light. I didn't know what that something was yet, but I could feel it on the horizon, waiting for the right moment to disrupt our normal, fragile life. I woke up with a start. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that made the air feel thick. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep, when I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the direction of the door. My heart skipped a beat. It was late. Why was anyone up at this hour? I sat up, the confusion swirling in my head as my eyes tried to adjust to the darkness. I wasn't sure if I had imagined the noise or if something was actually wrong. Then, the door creaked slightly and I froze. The outline of a figure stood just inside the doorframe, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the hallway. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. It was my son. He was standing there, his small figure looking uncertain in the doorway. "Mom?" His voice was soft, almost hesitant. I hadn't expected to see him awake, let alone in my room at this hour. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear the haze of sleep. "What are you doing here?" I managed to whisper, my voice still thick with drowsiness. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his eyes wide and searching. I could sense that something wasn't right, that there was something off in the air between us. A moment passed before he took a step closer to the bed, his eyes locked onto me. But they weren't the eyes of the innocent child I had tucked into bed hours ago. They were the eyes of someone who had seen something unsettling. "Mom," he repeated, but this time his voice was trembling. Why were you with him?" The words hit me like a cold wave, and I felt my stomach drop. His words didn't make sense at first, but then they began to sink in. I couldn't move, couldn't respond, because I didn't know how. My mind was spinning, trying to process the implications of what he had just said. He had seen something. What had he seen? Had he been awake longer than I realized? I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I was paralyzed, not from fear of my son, but from the realization that this moment, this innocently spoken question, had shattered whatever fragile piece had existed in my mind. My heart pounded as I tried to gather my thoughts, to form a coherent response. But the truth was, I didn't have one. "Why were you with him?" my son repeated, this time more forcefully, his voice filled with confusion and something else. Hurt, maybe? It was a question that felt more like an accusation, and in that moment, I realized there was no easy way out. He had seen something. I didn't know what, but I knew it was bad. The guilt flooded in, thick and suffocating. I tried to reach for an answer, any answer, but nothing came to mind. How could I explain? How could I tell him the truth? Could he even understand what had happened? How did I even explain to him that the person he trusted most had betrayed that trust in the worst possible way? I saw the confusion in his eyes, the hurt that was just beginning to form. And I knew, at that moment, that our lives would never be the same. It wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about my own guilt or my own shattered trust. It was about him, my son, who had just witnessed the unraveling of the life we once knew. I wanted to say something, anything, to make it better, to reassure him. But the truth was, there was nothing I could say. My world was falling apart, and my son had walked into the heart of it all. And now, there was no turning back. The weight of the consequences hung heavy in the air, and I could feel it pressing down on me. His eyes never left mine as he waited for an answer, but I couldn't give him one. The truth was too complicated, too painful. And as the silence between us stretched on, I realized that this moment, this question, had changed everything. The silence between my son and I was unbearable. He stood there, waiting for an explanation, his small frame trembling as the weight of the moment settled in. I couldn't move. The words I had hoped would come couldn't find their way past the lump in my throat. His eyes, filled with confusion and something else, hurt, burned into me, and I knew I had to face the truth. There was no hiding anymore. "Mom, why were you with him?" His voice, fragile yet demanding, echoed in the room. I felt a deep pang of guilt pierce through me. What could I say? How could I explain this to him? My mind raced, searching for some form of solace or clarity, but nothing came. I had let this happen. I had allowed everything to crumble, piece by piece, and now here I was, standing at the brink of losing everything. The door to my marriage had been opened, and what lay beyond it was ugly and irreparable. The affair, the betrayal, the lies, it was all out in the open now, and I had no choice but to confront it. What hurt the most wasn't just the act itself, but the realization that I had failed not only my spouse but my child as well. The person I loved and trusted, the one I had built a life with, was no longer someone I could turn to. The betrayal went deeper than I ever realized. I felt the tears threaten to come, but I pushed them back. I couldn't break down now. Not in front of my son. He needed to understand, or at least have some semblance of understanding. But what could I possibly say? What words could explain how everything had fallen apart? My mind flashed to the moment I realized my marriage wasn't what I thought it was. The signs had been there, subtle at first, an offhand comment, a missed anniversary, late nights at work. Little things that seemed insignificant in the moment, but had slowly built up to something bigger. I never wanted to admit it to myself, but the truth had been knocking on my door for a long time. And when it finally forced its way in, I didn't know how to stop it. I couldn't look at my son anymore. His innocence had been shattered by something he couldn't possibly understand. I had been the one who opened that door for him, letting him see the ugliness of our reality. The pain in his eyes was worse than any punishment I could have received. I had betrayed him too, by allowing him to witness the unraveling of the life we had. And then there was my husband, the one person I had trusted, the one person I had promised to share everything with. I had thought we were in this together, that we were building a life side by side. But somewhere along the way, he had found someone else. Or maybe I had pushed him away unknowingly, while I became consumed by the responsibilities of being a mother, a wife, a caretaker. I never saw it coming. His betrayal hit harder because it was something I had never expected from him. I had trusted him more than I should have, never suspecting that the very person I relied on the most would be the one to shatter my world. I sat there, frozen, as the realization of what had happened hit me like a wave. The affair wasn't just about infidelity. It was about broken trust, lost opportunities, and fractured relationships. My husband and I were no longer the people we once were. And now, neither was I with my son. The betrayal had reached its deepest point, and the aftermath was now my responsibility to navigate. The guilt was suffocating, drowning me in a sea of regret. I had allowed this to happen. I had stayed blind to the cracks in our marriage, thinking that love was enough to hold us together. But love wasn't enough when trust had been shattered, when secrets had been kept. And now I had to deal with the consequences of those choices, of the broken pieces I had left behind in the wake of my actions. My son was still staring at me, his face twisted in confusion. I had to say something, anything. But what could I say that would make this all right? What could I say to undo the damage, to repair what had already been broken? There was no easy way out. The truth was out now, and there was no escaping it. The pieces of our family, of our lives, had scattered, and I didn't know how to put them back together again. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words feeling hollow. They weren't enough. They could never be enough. But they were all I had left to offer. The damage had been done, and now the hard part was facing the fallout. The days after that moment were a blur. I couldn't look at my son without feeling a deep pang of regret, guilt sinking deeper with each passing hour. His innocent question had cracked the walls I had carefully built around myself, and now the cracks were too wide to ignore. I was left trying to pick up the pieces, but no matter how hard I tried, everything felt shattered beyond repair. I had failed him, failed my marriage, and failed myself. My husband's response was nothing short of what I expected. He was angry, devastated, and deeply hurt. The silence between us had become unbearable, and every word that passed between us seemed like a dagger. We no longer communicated with the warmth we once had. Instead, there was an icy barrier between us, one that neither of us knew how to break. We'd been broken for some time now, but neither of us had the courage to acknowledge it until it was too late. I was overwhelmed by a sense of isolation, not just from my husband, but from the life I had built. Our son, who had once been the source of joy in our home, now seemed like a constant reminder of how far we had fallen. He was confused, scared, and angry, and I couldn't blame him. I had let him down in ways I hadn't even fully realized. The trust he had placed in me was shattered, and I couldn't figure out how to put the pieces back together. There were days when I simply didn't know where to begin. There was no manual for how to navigate the mess I had created. I tried to talk to my husband, but every conversation turned into a battle. He couldn't look at me without seeing the betrayal, and I couldn't look at him without feeling the weight of my choices. We were two strangers bound together by a history that now felt like a lie. The love we once had was clouded by resentment, and the truth hung over us like a constant shadow. But amidst the wreckage, I knew one thing. I had to find a way to heal. I couldn't undo what had been done, but I could try to rebuild. Rebuilding wasn't about pretending everything was fine. It was about understanding the depth of the damage, confronting it, and then figuring out how to move forward, even if that meant doing it alone. The path ahead wasn't clear, but I knew I had to keep going, for my son's sake and for my own. I had to make amends with him. I had to show him that I was still his mother, that despite everything, I loved him. But how could I ask for his forgiveness when I hadn't forgiven myself? How could I ask him to trust me again when I had betrayed that trust in the most unforgivable way? There were moments when I considered leaving, walking away from everything in hopes of finding some semblance of peace. But I couldn't do that to my son. I couldn't run away from the mess I had made. No matter how much I wanted to, I had to face the consequences of my actions. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. This wasn't a story with a simple resolution. It was the painful, messy truth of life, one that I had to accept, even if it broke me in the process. I spent nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how things had gone so wrong. I thought about my husband, about how we had gotten to this point, and I realized